You know that feeling when you read something that fundamentally changes the way you think about an aspect of the world. I had that experience about a year ago when I picked up a book called Underground Empire: How America Weaponized the Global Economy by two academics called Henry Farrell and Abraham Newman. Their book is essentially an alternative history of US foreign policy over the last 2.5 decades, where the core tools of state power are computer protocols and undersea cables and financial networks, as opposed to warships and treaties. Their central idea is that the US discovered, somewhat by accident and somewhat reluctantly, that being at the center of an interconnected world economy gave it weapons it could use against its adversaries. This led to the vast espionage programs exposed by Edward Snowden, the whistleblower, financial sanctions against Iran, Russia, and others, and most recently, prohibitions on exporting advanced technologies to China. Farrell and Newman call this phenomenon weaponized interdependence. And the big paradox posed by their book is that this state of affairs is clearly unstable, but that it's impossible to decouple economies of the size and complexity of the United States and China. I thought it was time to check in on this idea. So this week on The Big View, we're taking a look at the limits of American economic power. It's what we do at Reuters Breaking Views. We tap our best sources around the world to bring you fresh insights into the biggest stories in global business and finance. I'm your host, Peter Thar-Larsen. And I'm delighted to be joined by Henry Farrell. Henry is the SNF Agora Professor of International Affairs at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, member of the Council of Foreign Relations, a prolific author and blogger, and the writer of a thoughtful and eclectic newsletter on Substack called Programmable Mutter. And one important footnote, we recorded this conversation before we knew the results of the presidential election. Henry Farrell, welcome to the Big View podcast.
I'm delighted to be with you.
So, Henry, I thought we could just start with a recap of your thinking on this idea of weaponized interdependence and how that fit into the book you wrote, Underground Empire. How did that thinking evolve? Was there sort of an aha moment where all these different strands, technology, finance, various other things came together?
Yes, there was. And the reason that we began, and this, I should say, this is myself and my co-author, Abraham Newman. The reason we began to get interested in these issues was a kind of a confluence between two interests that we had. We had just finished writing a book, which was a much more academic book, which was about EU-US fights over privacy. And one of the things that had really come up in that was the SWIFT financial messaging network, which really was not the kind of thing that international relations professors like myself and Abe paid much attention to. And Abe had the instinct that there was something interesting that was happening there. And I had a similar instinct about financial sanctions because I knew that the ways in which global financial sanctions worked were very, very different from the ways that political scientists thought about it. And so we began to start chatting about this, and we realized that there was a possible connection, and that if we thought about the ways in which the world's networks, the financial networks, the economic networks, trade networks, and information networks hang together, and what kinds of structures those networks had, we might be able to tell a different kind of a story about how financial coercion, economic coercion, and surveillance fit together. The basic idea being here that we used to think about these networks as being very, very decentralized, but in fact, they have become extremely centralized over time in ways that were to the advantage of the United States of America. And so really that was the story of the article, was trying to trace through the mechanisms through which that had happened. It was an article that was written primarily for an academic audience, but because nobody else was really writing about this in this way, we began to get a lot of take-up from people in the policy world, from people in the broader world of ideas. And I think what we had really done was to articulate a set of notions that were on the tip of everybody's tongue, but that nobody quite had been able to articulate explicitly up to that point. So we found ourselves with the academic equivalent of a runaway hit, which is to say not really a hit in real world terms at all, but nonetheless, the fact that we were there with this idea, began to get policy debates going in a somewhat different direction. And then we decided that we would write a book about that. And of course, the book ended up being very, very different from the academic article in terms of its audience and in terms of its writing.
Yeah, it's obviously events have kind of helped to sort of to illustrate and illuminate your idea. I mean, one of the reasons that I was so keen to talk to you about this was because we've been sort of living through this real life experiment in weaponized interdependence in Russia. I mean, the last 3 years, almost 3 years, the US, Europe, and to a certain extent Japan have really waged sort of full on economic warfare. I'm just curious, what do you think that we've learned from that about how successful has that been?
So what we have learned is that some things are much, much more successful than others in this world. So I think that if you look at the arguments that we made, our arguments were really around the centralization of global finance. And globalized finance has remained relatively centralized. So when we see the impact of financial sanctions and so on, it's clear that they have had a significant impact, albeit not as great an impact as one might have expected at the beginning, but also in part that is because nobody wants to completely disconnect Russia from the global financial system in the same way that Iran was disconnected, because there were fears that this would, for example, lead to massive increases in the price of oil and all of the political consequences that might flow from that. Nonetheless, it's clear that these financial measures have had a significant impact. They have not, as some people had hoped, they have not resulted in immediate financial and economic crisis or collapse in Russia. Russia has found ways to keep on working within the system, and its economy is ticking over as a war economy reasonably well. Equally, it's very, very clear that Russia has taken some substantial long-term damage. It has taken a substantial long-term hit, albeit not so much that it has shown any intentions of looking to roll back its war effort. Where I think we have seen much less success is in the effort to try and build upon that lesson and to apply a kind of financial sanctions logic to global high-tech supply chains of one sort or another. So we saw the kinds of measures that have now been deployed against China with regard to advanced AI semiconductors were really, I think, pioneered to some extent with respect to Russia. And we've seen that on the one hand, this has probably had some consequences, but on the other hand, it has turned out to be much, much more difficult for the United States to administer. It has been much more difficult to really use chokeholds in the same kind of way against Russia, because the chokeholds simply aren't there to the same extent, and also because the kinds of information that the US would like to have isn't there either. So when you look at how it is that financial sanctions work, a lot depends upon the fact that the United States does have its hooks into financial institutions. There are a lot of reporting requirements that banks have to fulfill. There are ways in which the US can tap into data from SWIFT and from other sources in order to tell where money is coming from, where it is going to. When it comes to trade in components of one sort or another, it's a much, much messier, much more complex project. Individual businesses themselves very often don't have a super clear idea of who the final customer might be for a more complicated product. And that in turn makes it far, far more difficult for the government to really dig in the same way as it has in financial sanctions. So that is, I think, why we have seen a move over time. The United States was extremely optimistic, I think, at the beginning, that it might be possible to really apply the same kinds of chokeholds with export controls as it has done with these financial measures. And over time, it's really, I think, moderated its ambition significantly and is now moving back to increased use of financial tools, increased use of sanctions of one sort or another, in the belief that these provide better leverage, that these are more plausibly usable tools than the tools that had previously applied.
Yeah, okay, that's very interesting. I mean, we'll definitely want to come back to some of the AI stuff a bit later on. I think just on your point about finance, I mean, one of the sort of key ideas I think in the book is that the US, by weaponizing these networks, is also making them less stable. And we've clearly seen other countries, not just Russia, but also China, sort of stepping up their efforts to try and make themselves less vulnerable to being choked by these chokeholds, as you described them. It all seems, there's a lot of debate about this. It all seems a little bit halting and a little bit sort of fringe activity at the moment. But how seriously should we take these efforts? Like this, Putin was talking the other day about this BRICS bridge, which is supposed to be some sort of alternative to the dollar system, which would allow these countries to move money around. Do you see that as gaining any traction?
I don't see it as gaining any traction under current conditions, but that might change. And when I say I don't see it gaining any traction, what I mean to say is that I don't see it gaining traction as a serious alternative to the current West-dominated system that we have. I do think that this will be used around the edges. I think that this will be used, our systems like this will be used as a means of blunting some of the force of the actions that the United States and the European Union have taken. But I don't think that there is sufficient will and sufficient enthusiasm to actually begin to really apply these measures in any very, very general way. And if you look at this from the point of view of the countries in question, first of all, I think that BRICS ministers, of course, sort of grand statements are very, very cheap to deliver. Actually building serious infrastructure is much, much harder. And it's much harder when you have extremely limited crossover of goals and aims among the countries in question. So I think all of these countries are, for one reason or another, quite annoyed with the way in which these systems are being weaponized against them. But you need much more than that to try and build an alternative. You need a common purpose, you need a common cause, and you need a high degree of trust among the actors in question, which I think simply does not exist. And and one of the great advantages that the United States and Europe have, which they are sometimes in danger of whittling away, is that they are countries and systems which are bound by the rule of law. And this then means that there are certain kinds of uses of these systems that are much less likely, that are much more difficult to get through, that might be subject to legal review of one sort or another. If you're talking about China or Russia, clearly the kinds of safeguards that the rule of law applies simply don't particularly work when you've got a partially closed economy, still like China, when it comes to currency. There are a lot of trade-offs that these countries face and a lot of opportunities or temptations that they have, which aren't quite there to the same extent for the United States and for Europe. So I would expect that we're still going to see a certain amount of talk about these things. We will see projects being announced, but I don't think that we're going to see really, really wide-scale take-up of these until and unless we get into a situation where the politics become much more serious. If you saw a United States that was willing to really throw its weight around in a much more aggressive and uncoordinated fashion, then you might actually see some take-up happening, and you might even see countries such as members of the European Union beginning to think that they probably wanted to have some degree of safety from the United States. There was some talk about this during the period after the United States pulled out of the JCPOA and started to sanction or threaten to sanction Europeans.
The Iranian
exactly
the Iranian deal. Yeah,
exactly. So more or less, what happens is that the Trump administration, after dillying and dallying for a little bit, pulls out of the JCPOA and then starts to announce extensive sanctions or threats of sanctions against European companies which have gone back into Iran, despite the fact that they are merely complying or taking advantage with a deal that the United States itself under a previous administration has signed up to. And so at that point, you begin to see a lot of conversation happening in Europe around alternative payment systems. This is something we talk about in the book. So you get the German foreign minister talking about how we might need to think about how to build SWIFT in different ways, how to have alternative European institutions, all of this with the idea that the United States was becoming increasingly treacherous, perhaps, at the very least highly unpredictable and untrustworthy, and that Europe might need different options. And so there was, at that moment, there was a very definite willingness to start considering things that had never previously been considered. You might get that again if we get an administration which is perhaps even more unpredictable than Trump one was. But I don't think that you're going to see any push towards this kind of arrangement happening in a very serious way unless we are in that world, in a world where really the alternative of continuing to rely upon a centralized system is so egregiously problematic that the costs just seem to outweigh the benefits.
Yeah, I just want to come back to this idea about, you talked about coercion. And I mean, clearly, a lot of this discussion is about how America's used this system. But I suppose, I mean, the other way you could turn it around and sort of say, well, and people do in the US, say, well, this is a situation where the US is being threatened or being taken advantage of, or whatever words you want to use, through its underwriting of this global economic system. And so, a couple of weeks ago, Jake Sullivan, who's Joe Biden's national security advisor, did a sort of speech where he talked about the kind of what they tried to do, and I think tried to sort of set out some sort of guidelines for how these things should be applied in the future. And he talked about, he had this snippet of a quote from Alexis de Tocqueville talking about interest rightly understood. The idea was simply, we're just acting in our self-interest, and wouldn't any other reasonable country sort of do the same? I mean, what do you make of that argument?
Well, I think that there is a lot of talk on both sides of this, which is, it's a little bit like the famous scene in Casablanca where people are outraged about gambling. And people tend to get very outraged about economic coercion to the extent that they really think that economic coercion is never something that they themselves do, or if it is something that they do with some degree of regret and for purely altruistic and noble motives, or else perhaps just because this is what any reasonably minded government would do under the circumstances. So you get but the other side, when other people do it, when other countries do it, it is the most awful thing ever. And I've been in conversations with US government officials where they have denied point blank that they are engaged in economic coercion. In fairness, Sullivan isn't one of these. And I've just kind of, so I've lifted my eyebrows, would say, really? You think that is true? So I think that the way to think about this is not to look at this in exceptionally moralistic terms. At least I don't look at it in those ways. If you look at global politics is frequently a pretty unpleasant place. You can imagine ways in which these coercive tools can be used for good as well as for evil. And I think that there is inevitably going to be some degree of coercion and use of force, whether economic force or military force. That is something that is a part and parcel of international politics in a world like the world that we live in. Equally, I don't think that this should distract from the conversation, which the United States still has not had in the way that it needs to have, about under what circumstances should economic coercion be deployed. What does it do to the long-term interests of the United States? Is the United States really interested in building up some kind of multilateral order again, given its partial move away from that? What would that involve? How would you be able to weave in the new realities of economic coercion into it? These, I think, are really important conversations, and they're conversations which haven't really begun, either on the US side or the China side, or for that matter, the various other countries, the non-aligned countries. We don't have a real conversation yet happening about the circumstances under which this is acceptable or unacceptable. There is no equivalent of the laws of war for economic coercion, and that's a problem.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, I did have someone in the administration say to me recently, talking about the sort of the carrots and the sticks. Said you don't win hearts and minds with sanctions, right? So there is at least, I think, some sort of recognition that maybe that they'd have to do something. They might have to do some things which are more positive. And one thing you could look at there is sort of what the Biden administration has done in terms of industrial policy. I mean, the huge amounts of money that are being thrown at the CHIPS Act to stimulate semiconductor production, the Inflation Reduction Act, and renewable power. Obviously, some European allies and other allies have their gripes about this because they think it's sort of pulling manufacturing and jobs out of their economies. But do you see industrial policy as sort of another aspect of this sort of arsenal of weapons that are being used?
Yes and no. I think that it is clearly being used. This is one of the major justifications which was made for the CHIPS Act. It is clearly being used in part to shore up vulnerabilities and to make sure that the United States is not subject to coercive tactics being used against it. And furthermore, it is being used, to make sure that the United States is, for example, is less vulnerable to a war happening in the Taiwan Straits. That if the United States has a separate advanced semiconductor manufacturing base, it is going to be capable of surviving much, much better, and perhaps to some limited degree, some very limited degree, that might change the calculus on both sides of that very, very difficult question. Equally, I think it does clearly create difficulties for the United States in figuring out how to build relations with allies. And this is something that I've heard senior administration people say. They have acknowledged that one of the problems of the IRA in particular was that they hadn't really thought through what kinds of consequences this would have for their ability to build up joint relationships with allies if they're trying to build supply chains that do not purely and simply rely upon stuff happening domestically within the United States. That requires a different set of institutions, which the Biden administration has been a little bit slow to build and has been much less multilateral in its actions than it has been in its rhetoric. In fairness, I think that is not because of any actual ill intention, but just because of the realities of domestic politics. So that domestic politics pose very, very significant challenges to anybody who really wants to say, well, let's have this investment happening in Europe rather than the United States. That, at the least, is a somewhat difficult thing to sell to taxpayers. And I think that more generally touches upon the question that you've put your finger on here, which is that it is much, much cheaper for the United States to impose sanctions and to use these tools of economic coercion as a means of getting its way than to provide the carrot. If you're trying to provide the carrot, that is something that imposes a direct and immediate and visible burden on US taxpayers. And certainly there are people in the Biden administration at senior levels who are very, very well aware of the problem of continued use of economic coercion in areas where butter rather than the financial equivalent of guns would work a lot better to smooth and to oil the mechanisms of cooperation between different governments. But it's extremely difficult to get there given domestic politics and given the difficulties of spending upon an international order that has become much less defensible in domestic terms in a US political debate.
Yeah. So one of the sort of seductive ideas, I think, behind the US approach is that these are sort of precision weapons that, wielded by competent technocrats. They can be used very selectively. And Jake Sullivan, we keep talking about him, kind of summed this up by saying the US was trying to protect, a small yard with a high fence, right? I think it's fair to say you're quite skeptical of that idea. Can you explain?
Yes, I can. And I think that if you look at the world that has unfolded over the last 4 years or so of the Biden administration is a much more complex world than the world that the small yard, high fence suggested was going to be. So the idea behind this notion that Sullivan had is something like the following, that if you're looking at it from Sullivan's perspective, he wants to do two things very reasonably as a senior official in the Biden administration. First of all, he wants to protect US national security. Secondly, he wants to do so in the context of a relationship with China, where the United States is not completely decoupling itself from China. So this is not like the Cold War, where there was very little in the way of real economic interchange, except in a couple of areas such as grain, between the United States and the USSR. This is in the context of a continued economic relationship, which will be extremely disruptive for the United States as well as for China if it unravels for some reason because U.S. security begins to interfere with ordinary relationships So the idea there was that Sullivan more or less was saying, we are going to be particularly attentive to a small group of so-called foundational technologies, areas such as AI, which have clear military application as well as civilian application. These are going to be the small yard. There's going to be a very high fence around them, but we will not particularly care very much if you're investing, I don't know, in cheap plastic toys or other things. China can continue to export those to its heart's content. But the problem with that, I think, has turned out to be that, first of all, the technologies that have these applications tend also to be the foundational technologies for innovation in general. So there is a belief, I think a somewhat mistaken belief, that AI is about to produce this cornucopia of incredible economic awesomeness anytime real soon now. If you just put another $150 billion into Sam Altman's hands, the world is going to be changed into a utopia. There are similar consequences. Of course, semiconductors are absolutely basic to the way that the world economy actually functions, as we discovered during the pandemic. And some people make similar claims with regard to quantum computing, although there, I think the case is much more modest. But there are many other areas in which you could perhaps see unforeseen developments having real consequences, so that large language models, the form of AI that everybody is talking about these days, are really an application of two things: neural networks, combined with some speculations that Claude Shannon, the father of information theory, had back in the 1940s about a statistical word prediction. And nobody had any idea that this was going to create this extraordinary, possibly transformative economic technology. And so there are many, many other areas like that. It becomes really, really hard to predict, especially of the future, as I guess Yogi Berra, probably not Yogi Berra, but somebody like Yogi Berra was supposed to have said. And so you then get combined with a general fear of China and Chinese technological development, you get this resulting in a fence which is likely to become substantially wider over time. If, for example, the China Committee in Congress gets its way, you get the sense that this fence should be expanding outwards so quickly that you basically get sort of those redshift effects from relativistic speed. Sort of it is moving so fast that you literally cannot see how fast it is moving. So I think that this was a somewhat useful political strategy in that it helped to stabilize for a period, but I do not think that it is the basis for any kind of long-term policy that the United States has. And I think the other question, which is a much bigger question that the United States now has, is that this is a policy which is based on an assumption of United States technological superiority. There are a number of areas, including very important areas, where China is assuming a high degree of technological sophistication, is outmatching the United States. If we think about the kind of stack of technologies around the green economy, photovoltaics to some extent, much more battery, if we look at electric cars. And now the United States is being confronted with a much more difficult set of questions, which is, how does the United States respond when it is the laggard rather than the leader? And this poses a new set of questions that any new administration in the United States is going to have to face into. And the conversation is extremely difficult to get going because Americans don't like to believe that they could possibly be second best at stuff. And talking about that in public becomes an extremely difficult thing to do.
Yeah. So maybe just sort of to wrap this up, I mean, there's a very memorable line from your book where you say, "There's no visible exit from the underground empire. Every tunnel that seems to lead out ends up turning back in on itself." Everybody's sort of locked into this interdependent system. But going back to what you were saying earlier about the sort of a possible future unreliable US administration, I mean, some people would argue that the US has already become unreliable because when the outcomes, the presidential election depends on a handful of voters in Pennsylvania and a few other swing states, then you can't really plan. There's no consistency. You can't really plan for things. But let's assume that we talk about sort of a future administration that sort of weaponizes all of this to a much greater extent. Can you foresee in that situation that then maybe the decoupling that people think is so unimaginable then becomes more possible, even if it becomes very painful?
I think that we could well see some substantial degree of decoupling. I think it would be an extremely messy world. I think that the idea that we will get back to neatly defined power blocks of the sort that we had in the Cold War, with the US on one side with its allies, the USSR, and its servant states on the other, and a bunch of non-aligned countries trying to play the odds. I do not think we're ever going to get back to that world. I think that the economies, that the technologies are too deeply and too intimately connected to each other. And also the fact remains that China is state capitalism, but it is state capitalism in a way that the Soviet Union was not. It is not. It is a recognizable variant of the capitalist system. The communist ideology is still there, but you see a very weird economy in which very inefficient state-owned enterprises coexist with a private sector that is thriving. So I don't think that you're going to see the same kind of direct ideological stroke economic standoff that you saw in the past. What I do think you're going to see happening in that world is a world in which there is a higher degree of interdependence, a much higher degree of unpredictability, as the US does one thing, China does another, Europe probably in that world begins to become much more directly engaged in geostrategy than it has been in the past. And I think there have been some very, very interesting noises coming from Europe about what might happen in that kind of world, what Europe might try to do. So I think you would have patches of multilateralism still coexisting with substantial parts of the economy in which you have new restrictions being applied, and extreme difficulty in predicting when the patches of multilateralism are going to grow or prevail, when they're going to be beaten back by this or that unilateral measure. And this is going to be an extremely uncomfortable world for business, because I think businesses have gotten very used to the world of globalization. I saw that Maurice Chang of TSMC said again a week ago, more or less what he had said before, that this is just a fundamentally new world, that you cannot get away from geopolitics. I think that this is something which is going to be true for business from here on in, that they are going to really have to have geopolitics as a central aspect of business strategy in the C-suite, because the markets that you operate in are defined by politics. They are always defined by politics. For a long time, that politics seemed to be highly predictable. You had a good sense of what was happening, so you didn't have to pay attention. That is not going to be true again, probably in our lifetimes. We are going to see some degree of, I think, stability possibly emerge, or meta-stability, but it is going to be a meta-stability at the top, with a lot of messiness and surge and unpredictability in the bits of the economy that businesses have to pay attention to.
Yes. Well, that is probably a good place to finish. I mean, I feel like we could carry on for a long time. There's lots more to explore, and I think the way you've described it, there's a lot of complexity and difficulty that we're facing. So maybe we can come back to this in the future. But Henry, I just want to say thank you for your time. It's a really fascinating discussion, and hope we can continue the discussion at some other point.
Wonderful, and I would of course be delighted to. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Oliver Taslich in London. You can listen to a new episode of The Big View every Tuesday on the Reuters app or your favorite podcast platform. Don't forget to tune into our sister podcast, The Viewsroom, every Thursday, as well as the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. If you like what you hear, please follow The Big View and let us know what you think. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.